Hey everyone, it's Pastor George back to give current events some eternal perspective. Welcome to part 4 of our series, Acts of Faith. Do you ever wish you had a superpower? Something cool that no one else could do. Now, flying is probably at the top of my list. Some people like the idea of super strength or maybe breathing underwater. Something about defying the laws of nature and doing the impossible just sounds fun. Did you know that at least one disciple had a superpower? I mean, at least for a moment anyway. The Gospels record that after feeding the 5,000, the disciples got back into their boat to go across the lake. But while they were out there, the weather turned nasty on them. But in that moment, an act of faith showed that with God, nothing is impossible. Meanwhile, the disciples were in trouble far away from the land, for a strong wind had risen, and they were fighting heavy waves. Now about 3 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came towards them, walking on the water. And when the disciples saw him walking on the water, they were terrified. In their fear, they cried out, "It's a ghost!" But Jesus spoke to them at once. "Don't be afraid," he said. "Take courage. I am here." Well, then Peter called to him, "Lord, if it's really you, tell me to come to you walking on the water." "Yes, come," Jesus said. So Peter went over the side of the boat and he walked on the water towards Jesus. Now let's pause here long enough to consider the faith that it took for Peter to swing his legs over the side of that boat. Observably, there's no reason that should have worked. Peter was a fisherman. He knew how dangerous the waters were. In the middle of a storm, Peter could drown in moments if he left the relative safety of his ship. But let's remember something here. Peter wanted to get out of that boat. He wanted to be where Jesus was. And for a moment, Peter trusted Jesus that when his Lord called, he would be totally safe. And it was an act of faith for Peter to step out of that boat. He believed what Jesus called him to do, despite the unfavorable circumstances. And many of us have taken our own steps of faith towards Jesus, believing him when he calls us out of our own boats to come to him and be where he is leading us. Now we throw caution to the wind, as it were, and we feel like it's all going to work out, even if the circumstances don't totally make sense or are less than ideal. So we take that job, or we move to that city, or any number of big steps that ask us to leave our relative safety. And in doing so, we're believing that when we put our feet down on unsteady surfaces, that the Lord will give us the power to walk. But let's be honest. Sometimes we boldly and faithfully step into new circumstances, convinced we are following the Lord, and it all starts to get a little overwhelming. Maybe it's the time commitment, maybe it's money, maybe it doesn't all go exactly as you imagined, and so our faith starts to falter and we start to feel like we're sinking, or in Peter's case, literally sinking. But when Peter saw the strong wind and the waves, he was terrified. He began to sink. "Save me, Lord," he shouted. Jesus immediately reached out and grabbed him. "You have so little faith," Jesus said. "Why did you doubt me?" That's such a good question. Now Peter got out of the boat and he started walking on water, defying everything that we know about hydrophysics. He believed Jesus and wanted to be where he was. Well, so what happened? What changed? It was the same water as before. Jesus didn't change his instructions or his calling. It was the same wind and the waves as before. Nothing changed except Peter. Somehow, in the few moments between getting out of the boat and literally walking on water, and before he started to sink, Peter forgot the reality of what was happening. His faith in the calling of Jesus was allowing him to overcome circumstances, not to mention gravity, and to do something only possible by the power of God. But the moment he started focusing on the water and not the call of Jesus, he started to slip. How many of us have been there? What we started out doing so confidently begins to seem impossible. But really, nothing has changed except we take our eyes off of Jesus. We fail to ask the question, well, why would God, who has called me to walk on water in his presence, all of a sudden leave me out here in the wind and the waves to drown? It just doesn't make sense. Because it doesn't make sense. The promise of Philippians 1:6 is as good for our everyday life as it is for our eternal salvation. And I am certain that God, who began the good work within you, will continue his work until it is finally finished on the day when Christ Jesus returns. Whatever God starts, he finishes. And whatever he's called us to do, he gives us the power and provision to see it through. Peter could have walked all over that lake if he'd remembered that the Lord who led him to take the first step would still be leading him on the last step. It takes faith to keep our eyes on Jesus when the wind and the waves surround us. It takes faith to step out of the boat and to do what the rest of the world might view as foolish or even impossible. But don't forget the one who is calling you. Remember, those who act in faith may just find themselves walking on water. God bless, and we'll see you next time.